Claude responded, "Some men come home to silence and call it peace. Some men come home to silence and call it peace." I came home 11 hours early from a business trip and found my granddaughter locked outside on the back porch in December. No coat, lips gone, the color of skim milk, and the woman I trusted to raise her looking at me through the kitchen window like I'd interrupted something. Let me back up, friend, because you're going to want the whole picture before I tell you what happened at that restaurant on Route 9. My name is Walter Grady. I'm 67 years old, and for 38 years I was a claims adjuster for one of the biggest property insurance carriers in the Northeast, out of Hartford, Connecticut. What that means in plain English is I spent my career walking into houses after fires and floods and finding out who was telling the truth and who was lying to collect a check. You learn to read a room fast in that job. You learn that people lie with their mouths and tell the truth with their hands, their eyes, the half-second pause before they answer a question they should have answered instantly. I was good at it. 38 years, and I never once got fooled on a claim. Funny how blind that made me at my own kitchen table. Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, grab a coffee, get comfortable, because this one's going to take a while, and I think you're going to need to sit with it. If you've got a minute, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. I always read them. My son Danny and his wife Marissa live 2 towns over from me, in a rental house on Cobb Hill Road outside Simsbury. Danny worked long shifts as a diesel mechanic, good with his hands, not much for words, always had been that way since he was a boy. Marissa passed when their daughter Emmy was 4. Aneurysm, out of nowhere, on a Tuesday morning while she was making pancakes. There's no way to talk about that kind of loss that doesn't sound smaller than it was, so I won't try. What I'll tell you is that Danny fell apart for about 6 months, and then he put himself back together the way men of that generation do, quietly, without asking anybody for help, and Emmy became the center of his whole world. She was 7 when Danny met Carol. Carol Pruitt walked into the diner where Danny sometimes ate breakfast before his shift, and according to him, she had this way of making a room feel warmer just by sitting down in it. She was a home health aide, good with elderly patients, patient and soft-spoken, and when Danny finally introduced her to Emmy, Carol got down on her knees right there in the driveway and said, "Your daddy tells me you're the smartest girl in the 3rd grade." Emmy, serious as a judge, said, "I'm actually 2nd smartest. Priya is smarter." Carol laughed like it was the funniest thing she'd heard all year, and I remember thinking, well, there it is. That's a good sign. A woman who doesn't need to be told she's right. I was wrong about that read. 38 years in claims, and I misjudged the one that mattered most. They married 16 months later. I told myself it was good for Emmy to have a mother figure again. I told myself Danny deserved to not be alone. I told myself I'd looked at Carol carefully, the way I looked at every claim, and she checked out clean. Here's what I know about fraud, and I saw plenty of it over the years. It's never loud. Nobody burns their house down with the neighbors watching. The lies are small and boring, and they hide in the paperwork nobody wants to read. You don't catch it by staring hard at the front door. You catch it by checking the receipts. My surface, that whole family's surface, looked fine. Good little rental house with a swing set out back. Emmy, in Girl Scouts. Carol posting pictures of family dinners on Facebook with captions about blessings. I was down in Delaware, visiting my sister, back in October, when Emmy's 2nd grade teacher, no, she'd have been in 3rd grade by then, Mrs. Halloran sent Danny an email saying Emmy had come to school twice that month with no coat and asked if everything was all right at home. Danny mentioned it to me on the phone, sort of laughing it off. Carol told him Emmy kept refusing to wear her coat, and it wasn't worth the fight every morning. He believed her. I was up in Bangor in November, working my last consulting job before full retirement, when Danny called and said Emmy had a nasty bruise on her hip. Carol said she'd fallen off the porch steps chasing the neighbor's cat. He believed that too. I believed it, from 300 miles away, because I wasn't looking. That's the part I have to live with. It was a Thursday, 2nd week of December, cold enough that the ground had that hard frozen look to it when my consulting contract in Bangor ended 4 days ahead of schedule. The client's board meeting got moved up, and there was nothing left for me to do up there. I didn't call ahead. I wanted to surprise Emmy, and I'd bought her a puzzle of Saturn's rings from a little science shop near my hotel because she'd gotten obsessed with astronomy over the summer and kept asking Danny for a real telescope. The puzzle was a stand-in, a maybe, I pulled up to the house on Cobb Hill Road around 4:40 in the afternoon. Danny was still at the shop, wouldn't be home till 6. The porch light wasn't on yet, though it was already going dim outside, that early winter dark. I parked in the gravel turnaround and started up the walk, and that's when I heard it. Small sound, crying, but not the loud kind kids do when they want attention. The quiet kind. The kind that's given up expecting anybody to come. I followed it around back. Emmy was sitting on the back porch, steps in just a t-shirt and leggings, no coat, no shoes, knees pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped around herself so tight her knuckles had gone white. Her lips had a bluish tint to them I will never forget as long as I live. She looked up at me, and her face did something I can only describe as disbelief, like she genuinely wasn't sure I was real. Grandpa Walt? Her voice came out cracked, barely there. I got down on that frozen porch faster than a 67-year-old man with 2 replaced knees has any business moving. Emmy, honey, how long have you been out here? Since after school. Her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely get the words out. Carol said I was disrespectful at dinner, and I needed to think about it outside. Since after school. It was 4:40. The bus dropped her at 3:15. I had my coat off and around her, before I even finished processing what she'd said, and I was already moving her toward the kitchen door, my hands shaking, and not from the cold. I banged on the glass. Carol appeared in the kitchen window a few seconds later, dish towel over her shoulder, and I watched her face when she saw me carrying Emmy and friend. I want to describe that face carefully, because it's the thing that started all of this turning over in my mind. It wasn't shock. It wasn't guilt. It was annoyance. The specific look of someone whose evening has been interrupted. She opened the door. Walter, you're back early. She's been outside for over an hour, Carol. No coat. It's 31 degrees out there. She was being fresh at the table. Carol's voice stayed perfectly even, the way you'd explain a parking ticket. A little cold air never hurt anybody. Builds character. I looked at my granddaughter shivering against my chest, her small hands starting to turn pink as the blood came back into them. And something in me went very quiet and very cold, the way it used to when I'd walk into a house fire claim and already know, before I'd even open the file, that the story didn't add up. She's not building character, I said. She's got hypothermia starting. Don't be dramatic, Walter. Carol turned back toward the stove like the conversation was over. I did not call 911 in that moment, and I want to be honest with you about why, because I've thought about it 100 times since. I am not a man who panics. I spent 4 decades keeping my voice level while homeowners screamed at me over denied claims. I know that blowing up a room gets you nothing except written off as unstable. What gets you something is documentation, patience, and waiting for the moment your opponent is the most comfortable, the most certain they've already won. I got Emmy warm. I wrapped her in every blanket in that house, made her hot cocoa with my own hands, sat with her under a quilt on the couch until her lips went back to a normal color and her shivering slowed to nothing. I checked her over as best I could without a medical degree, watched her breathing, kept talking to her softly so she wouldn't drift off, because a nagging voice in the back of my head, 38 years of reading incident reports, told me not to let a cold child fall asleep until I was sure. Emmy, honey, I said, once she'd stopped shaking enough to talk clearly, has this happened before? The outside thing? She looked at her hands for a long moment, the exact same posture Danny used to have as a boy when he'd done something wrong and was deciding whether to admit it. Except she hadn't done anything wrong at all. Sometimes, she said, when Carol has her book club ladies over. She says I need quiet time to think about my attitude. How many times, Bug? I don't know. Lots. She picked at the edge of the blanket. Sometimes it's the porch. Sometimes it's the garage. It's not so bad in the garage. There's the old couch out there. The garage. In December. In Connecticut. I did not raise my voice. I want that on the record. I sat with my granddaughter, and I let her finish her cocoa, and I turned on the cartoons she liked, and I called Danny's cell and told him to come home right now. Don't ask questions. Just come home. And then, while Carol was upstairs freshening up before he arrived, I did something I'd done 10,000 times in my career. I started documenting. I took photographs of Emmy's hands and feet with my phone, the redness, the faint blue tint that was just fading from her lips. I wrote down the time I'd arrived, the time I'd found her, everything Carol had said to me verbatim while it was still fresh. The way you write down a claimant's statement before their story has a chance to shift. I checked the thermostat log on the smart thermometer Danny had installed on the porch for his tomato plants. It kept a rolling 12-hour temperature history, and it told me, in cold hard data, that it had been 29 degrees at the time Carol put Emmy outside. Quote, and it had stayed in the low 30s the entire time. Then I did something Carol didn't know I could do. Danny had given me the login to their shared family calendar 2 years back when I used to help coordinate Emmy's doctor visits while he was working doubles. I pulled it up on my phone in that kitchen while the cocoa was still warming Emmy's hands, and I started scrolling backward. There it was, line after line. Emmy timeout porch, Emmy timeout garage, logged, almost administratively, like Carol was keeping her own record for some reason I couldn't yet understand, going back 4 months. 11 separate entries. 11 times my granddaughter had been put outside in the cold, in a New England autumn, and now a New England winter, for the crime of being 7 years old. I sat there in that kitchen, and the anger didn't come in a rush. It came in the way a slow leak fills a basement, quiet, steady, the water rising around your ankles before you even notice your shoes are wet. I had spent 38 years catching people who thought their fraud was airtight because nobody would ever check the small details. Carol had made the same mistake every fraudster makes. She thought nobody was reading the fine print of her own household. She forgot I'd built my entire career on exactly that kind of reading. Danny came through the door at 5:20, still in his work coveralls, smelling like diesel and cold air, and the second he saw Emmy wrapped in blankets on the couch with me sitting beside her, his whole face changed. Dad, what happened? I told him. All of it. The porch, the garage, the calendar entries, the smart thermometer log. I watched my son's face do something I'd only seen once before in my life. At Marissa's funeral, that same particular collapse of a person realizing the ground underneath them isn't what they thought it was. 11 times, he said. His voice barely made it out of his throat. 11 times and I never. You were working doubles to keep this house running, I said. She made sure you'd never be the one home to see it. Carol came down the stairs at that exact moment, hair freshly brushed, a cardigan draped over her shoulders like she was headed to a dinner party, instead of walking into the wreckage of her own lies. Danny, honey, you're home early. Your father's been making a whole production out of nothing. Danny looked at her, and I watched something in my son I hadn't seen since he was a young man defending his mother's memory against a distant relative who'd said something careless at the funeral. Nothing, he repeated. Dad has a temperature log from the porch thermometer, Carol. It's got a 12-hour history built in. It doesn't lie. I watched Carol's face for the tell. And friend, 38 years of reading claimants taught me exactly where to look. Not the face, the hands. Her fingers, resting on the stair railing, tightened for a quarter second, and then relaxed. The same motion I'd watched 1,000 times from people about to switch from denial to minimization. It builds resilience, she said, her voice climbing just slightly. My own mother used to send us outside when we misbehaved. Nobody died from a little fresh air. She has documented hypothermia symptoms, Carol, I said, quiet and even, the same tone I used to use closing out a fraudulent claim right to the claimant's face. And there's a calendar entry for every single time you did this, going back to August. The blood left her face in a way that told me everything her mouth hadn't yet admitted. I did call the police that evening, once Emmy was safely warm, and Danny was sitting with her, and I stood outside on that same porch, coat zipped to my chin, and gave the responding officer, a young man named Officer Patrick Kavanaugh, the calendar printout, and the thermometer log, and my own photographs, and my handwritten timeline, everything organized and dated the way I'd have organized a claims file for a judge. He looked through it with his flashlight, and I watched his expression shift the way Reyes's, no, the way any good first responders does, from routine to something considerably more serious. Sir, this is thorough, he said. I spent my career documenting things for a living, I told him. I know what a paper trail looks like. He made a call to the Department of Children and Families that night, and a caseworker named Diane Okafor came out first thing the next morning, a steady, no-nonsense woman who'd clearly heard every excuse a person could invent and stopped being surprised by any of them a long time ago. She sat with Emmy in the living room, gentle, patient, asking small, careful questions, and Emmy, in that guileless, matter-of-fact way children have when they don't yet understand how devastating their own words are. Told her about book club nights, and quiet time on the porch, and the old couch in the garage, and how Carol always said it helped her learn to be grateful for what she has. Did Carol ever tell you not to mention it to your dad? Diane asked gently. Emmy nodded, very small. She said Daddy works so hard and I shouldn't stress him out with my attitude problems. She picked at her sleeve. I didn't want him to be mad at me. The room went very still. Danny had to leave and stand in the kitchen for a minute. Diane Okafor looked at my folder for a long time without speaking. Mr. Grady, in 22 years, I don't think I've had a grandparent walk in a file this complete. I read insurance claims for 38 years, I said. You learn to never trust the story somebody tells you. You trust the paper. With this documentation, the officer's report, and Emmy's statement, she said, this becomes a priority case today. We're moving on an emergency protective order this afternoon. This afternoon, I repeated. This afternoon. I want to tell you I felt triumphant walking out of that meeting, some kind of movie scene satisfaction. But that isn't honest. It felt like standing at the end of a long assembly line, watching each piece lock into place exactly the way it was designed to, and feeling nothing yet but the specific bone-deep exhaustion of a man who'd been running on adrenaline and bad coffee for almost 20 hours straight. The feelings came later. Emmy came first. I drove back to the house and found her at the kitchen table with a bowl of the good cereal, the sugary kind Danny normally rationed, because on that particular morning nobody in that house had the heart to say no to anything she wanted. Grandpa, Walt, she said, did I get in trouble for telling? No, Bug, never. You did something very brave. Is Carol going to be mad? Carol's not going to be able to be mad at you anymore, I said. Not ever again. She considered that with the seriousness only a 7-year-old can bring to a bowl of cereal, and then she said, can we get a real telescope now, not a puzzle one? Kids are something else entirely, friend. They survive things that would flatten a grown man, and then they ask you about telescopes. Diane Okafor called Danny at 11:40 that morning to say the judge had signed the emergency order, Carol barred from the property, 0 contact with Emmy, and that police were coordinating with her office to serve the paperwork, alongside a request for questioning on charges of child endangerment and neglect. She asked whether we knew Carol's whereabouts, since they preferred not to serve her at the house while Emmy was present. Now here's the thing about a woman who's been married into your family for 2 years. You learn her patterns, whether you mean to or not. Every second Thursday of the month, Carol had her book club at 11, ladies from the neighborhood, followed always by lunch at the same place. A little bistro called the Copper Kettle, out on Route 9 in Avon. Same corner table by the window, every single time, rain or shine, because Carol liked being seen there. She'd texted Danny that very morning, book club today, lunch after, tell your dad I hope Emmy's feeling better, love you, with a little heart at the end. He hadn't answered. I know exactly where she'll be at noon, I told Diane. And she'll have an audience. I want you to picture the Copper Kettle at noon on a Thursday in December. String lights still up from the season, that particular warm buzz of a place where the local ladies who lunch go to be admired. Carol's table was right in the front window. 6 women, wine glasses half full, the specific performative laugh she used when she wanted the whole room to notice how composed and gracious she was, probably in the middle of telling her book club friends some soft, sympathetic version of the previous night, the long-suffering stepmother managing a difficult, dramatic child. I wasn't there myself. I didn't need to be. Danny told me every detail afterward because he drove out and sat in his truck across the street watching. 2 officers and Diane Okafor walked in at 12:35. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It slowed table by table, the way a room does when everybody senses something significant is happening and nobody wants to be caught staring. They walked straight to the window table. Diane set the protective order and the request for questioning down on the white tablecloth, right beside Carol's wine glass. Carol Pruitt Grady, I'm Diane Okafor with the Department of Children and Families. These officers need you to come with them. Carol looked at the papers, then at the officers, then at her friends. 5 women gone completely silent around their salads. This is a misunderstanding, she said, and Danny told me she used the voice, that same reasonable, composed voice that had worked on teachers and neighbors, and a trusting husband for 2 years running. My husband's father doesn't have the full picture. Ma'am, we need you to stand up, the officer said. Quiet. Final. She looked for a way out of it, Danny said, the way people do when they're calculating whether the room will let them talk their way sideways past this. It wouldn't. It didn't. The cuffs went on in full view of that window table, the neighboring tables, the bar, the entire lunch crowd, of the Copper Kettle in Avon, Connecticut, in front of the very women she had built that whole polished, put-together image for. Not one of them stood up for her. Not one. Back at the house, I changed the locks myself that afternoon while Danny sat with Emmy. We removed Carol from the emergency contact card at school by 3 o'clock, off the health insurance by 3:30, off every account that had her name near my granddaughter's by supper time. You automate the things that need to run clean, and I have never in my life wanted anything to run cleaner. Emmy spent that evening on the living room floor with her new puzzle of Saturn's rings, half assembled, and a documentary about the night sky playing on the television, the real telescope Danny had promised propped in its box by the door for the weekend. She fell asleep against my arm around 8:15, real sleep, deep and easy, the kind of sleep a child gets when nothing in her own house can hurt her anymore. I got a text from Diane Okafor around 8 that night. Carol had been formally charged, child endangerment and neglect, both felonies given the pattern and the documented medical risk, arraignment set for the following week. I read it twice, set the phone face down on the couch cushion, and looked at my granddaughter's face, slack and peaceful in the blue light of the television. And I thought about her mother, about Marissa flipping pancakes on a Tuesday morning she never got to finish, and I thought she'd be so proud of how brave this little girl was. I want to say something plain here, friend, because I think it matters more than the rest of the story. Some men leave a door cracked open when they walk away from something broken. They leave loose ends. They let themselves believe maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked. Maybe there's a version where everybody's still friends at Thanksgiving. I didn't leave a single door open. I locked every one of them. I filed every piece of paper. That particular deal, if you want to call it that, was closed for good, and my granddaughter got her whole life back because an old man who spent his career reading incident reports finally read one that mattered. If this story moved you tonight, hit that like button for me. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And subscribe if you haven't already, because there's more where this came from. I'll see you next time. Claude responded, sometimes the people who love us hardest aren't in the room with us every day. They're the ones paying quiet attention from a distance, ready to show up the mo. Sometimes the people who love us hardest aren't in the room with us every day. They're the ones paying quiet attention from a distance, ready to show up the moment it counts. Trust is a gift, but noticing is a responsibility. Check in on the ones you love, even when everything looks fine on the surface. And when a child finally finds the courage to tell the truth, the bravest thing you can do is simply believe her. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI for entertainment purposes, while hoping to share a genuine, positive life lesson along the way.